Hello and welcome to another installment of the Board Game Barrage podcast, a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends, even when you're losing. Tonight, I am Callan.
For tonight only.
For
night only.
Tonight only, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Mark and Neelan, the green and orange tank.
Here we are.
Hello, it's me.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. How's everyone doing?
Doing fantastic.
Very good.
On today's episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast, the very 73rd episode of the podcast, we are going to be your humble servants, your teachers, the board game slang, the board game terms that you might not know. You might listen to us and say, wow, they're so funny, but I don't know what they're saying. That is what tonight's episode is about. We're going to define some fun terms like fiddly, like crunchy.
Pod and seg.
Stop talking, Neelan. You may think you know what all those words mean, but let me tell you, you don't, and we will help you. But first, as always, what games have we been playing this past week?
I've been playing, we've all been playing. We just played this, in fact. The Shipwreck Arcana. Yeah, Mark was doing that throughout the game. It's very distracting,
That's right.
Considering it's a deduction game. And we're trying to think, and Mark's making shipwreck noises. The Shipwreck Arcana is a small card game that is a deduction cooperative game that I think was released at some point in 2017 and then reissued on Kickstarter and just shipped out. I just got my copy of it. The game plays with these 20 beautifully illustrated tarot cards. Each of them has a tarot name, like the knight, the merchant, the servant, the sort of thing you might expect. And each of these cards represents a place where you can place one of 7 numbered chips onto. So you have a bag of chips from 1 to 7. There's multiples of each of these numbers.
And to be clear, these are chips spelled C-H-I-P. I mean, it's Shipwreck Arcana, so you might be thinking S-H-I-P. But
right. They're they're fate chips,
right,
on the
fate,
ship.
So just you guys know what fate chips are. So
Yeah. Just imagine a fate chip. There's a lot of them in the bag. And on your turn, you draw 2 of them. If you had one from a previous turn, you would just draw a second one. Otherwise, if it's your first turn, you would draw 2. And you secretly look at them, and then the aim is to play one of them in a way to the board, face up, so as to give as much information about your remaining fate chip as possible. So these cards that are on the table, there are 4 of them out at all times. One of them might say, if the sum of your cards is greater than 11, you can play one of your fate chips here. If the difference between your fate chips is 4 or more, you can play one of them here. If you have a 1, 2, or a 3, and the other one isn't a 1, 2, or 3, you can play the 1, 2, or 3 here. So as you can see, if you play one of your chips there, you're instantly giving information about the other chip. If I had a 2 and a 6 in my hand, and I played the 2 to the 1, 2, and 3 card, then Kellen and Mark now know that my remaining fate is either a 4, 5, 6, or 7. I have a little array of these chips in front of me that are just used for their information. They flip down everything but the 4, 5, 6, and 7. And now if they want to, they can make a guess. They can say, I know that your remaining fate is a 5.
Nope, that's not how you make guesses in this game.
Oh, I'm sorry. You point at them ominously, and you say in a very sort of deep voice from the abyss.
Well, I go like this.
Mark does the Foley. You say, the
Your
fates have
fate.
spoken.
Your fate is 6.
The number 6.
So thematic.
Yep, absolutely. And if it's correct, you're getting a point. That's one of 7 points you need to win the game. If it's wrong, you get a doom point, which, depending on the difficulty, will advance you towards losing the game. The cards that you also play to also sort of have this system where the more chips you play to them, they start to fade over time, which is also going to be accelerating your defeat. So there's this balance of trying to figure out where a player is able to play to, what the logical move to have played with the chips they have is at all times, so that the other players are able to keep track of what chips you have left in your hand. Let's jump to you guys' quick thoughts. What do you guys think of the Shipwreck Arcana?
I like deduction games in general. This one sort of felt a little Hanabi-ish to me. That was the most analogous game because the pressure that you feel is when it's your turn, you don't want to mess up. You don't want to play one of your tiles to a spot where you shouldn't have. Often there's clearly one tile where you should have played in order to give your team maximum information, and the pressure is on to play it there. You know what I mean? So in that way, it's sort of like Hanabi. You always feel like you want to give the best clue or you want to make sure not to discard. So it's that sort of thing. And this is a game that I would play again In fact, I was happy to run it back. We played it once really quickly and failed, and then ran it back and succeeded. So I wouldn't mind playing it again. The only thing is, I don't know if it ever felt super fun to me. And maybe maybe when it comes to deduction, I want clever plays. Maybe is what I'm looking for. And this felt like, again, just like don't mess up more than especially fun.
It felt sort of like maybe a shared Mensa puzzle, or despite my misgivings about Mensa, I was in GATE as a fourth grader, which stands for Gifted and Talented Education Mark. And the entrance test exam felt kind of similar.
Sure.
It's almost a shared logic puzzle that you kind of sit there and goof off with each other about and think about. But where Hanabi feels like you may have a few different options of where to play or what to do based on the fact that you know a bunch of information, but you don't know your own information, versus this where you know your information but don't know the other information. This felt more like you were just waiting to not mess up. At the beginning of the game, it's kind of easy to not mess up. And then as the game goes, you're acquiring new powers that then there are more options. So it's almost a don't drop the hot potato sort of feeling, right. Except all your friends are going to be mad at you when you drop the hot potato. And that's fun if your group can handle it. But, we were immediately trash talking each other, literally like, unless Kellen is an idiot, your fate is too, and that's kind of funny, but also like I actually was annoyed at myself for having messed up in the first round, and I tried to kind of defend myself and got a little flustered about it, to be completely frank. The art is incredible. This is really neat and interesting. I think it'll be kind of self-evident based on what you've just heard if you're going to like this kind of thing.
Yeah.
My concerns are twofold for this. I think that there is probably a very limited shelf life on this. Even having now played it twice, I found the system extremely interesting, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But my interest in this reminds me of something like Magic Maze, where I'm more excited to show this to someone else than necessarily be excited to play it for myself. It's a very interesting design that I want people to see, but I don't think I'm necessarily excited to play a lot more of it. That said, I do think it hits something which is a big win for me. It is basically a puzzle. Like, it's deterministic is not the right word, but it's a puzzle that sort of arises of the combination of the cards that you have, the fates that you have. So it's like as if someone designed a Mensa puzzle or a logical puzzle, but it's one that's just evolved over the course of the game. What this leads to is kind of like anytime you play, there are three possible things that can happen, the way Kellen described. Either you mess up, which is probably going to feel bad. And honestly, there were moments where either of you have said, unless he's done something really wrong, and then you worry, it's like, oh no, maybe I've done this really terrible thing, and that would feel bad. Or everything went exactly as planned, and you put it on the only place that gave them the most information, therefore they were able to perfectly guess. Or you just draw an unlucky tile and you can't really play, or you're forced to do something suboptimal. It's like a very sort of restrictive number of outcomes, I think, which is potentially limiting. It's a game that I do want to show to people to sort of get a little bit more out of, but it's not one that I'm necessarily crazy excited about. The art is beautiful, though. All the art of these tarot-themed cards, and it's just a very striking, bold, thick-line art style. It's pretty good to look at. If that sounds all appealing, maybe try grabbing it on the cheap. It's not an expensive game. I think it's in the vicinity of $20. That is the Shipwreck Arcana.
So, I got to take a little trip and leave the land of these
Tiddlywink
and head to my homeland of New York City. And I got to play Kingdom Death Monster, which is not a Sandy Peterson game. Kingdom Death Monster, for those who don't know, is, I believe, the most funded board game Kickstarter of all time, or close to it, recently surpassed by Tainted Grail.
Right. It certainly was at one point.
Kingdom Death Monster is incredible miniatures, over-the-top production, tons of artwork, game that many people seem to back just for the minis and just for the painting of those minis. But Kingdom Death Monster is a very unique game campaign system where you go through a series of fights with different monsters, and then you return back to base camp to lick your wounds, upgrade your armor, use the loot that you got, upgrade your city, invest in new technologies, pick out different characters to take back with you, and then go back and fight another monster. And that's the game. And so a campaign can last somewhere about 30-ish years, which is that phase of in town and then leave town and fight a monster. It's an extremely difficult game to describe and discuss. It felt so unique. The start of the first mission is the board is very black, almost entirely. The corners of the board are black, and there's this sort of pillar of light, and in the middle of it is the white lion. And then there are 4 survivors, and you are sort of placed around the lion, and the rule book is a storybook that has like 7 full-color illustrations at the beginning, and there's only 2 sentences of story, like you find yourself in this place, and it's so lovingly made. I actually enjoyed reading the story, and the reason I did is because there were only 2 lines on each page, and then you're looking at artwork,
right?
Which I've never liked a board game story ever. And then all of a sudden, we're fighting the White Lion, who is we could lose. I'm sitting here going, Kurt, isn't this the tutorial? And it's like, no, we're dying. We're almost dead. You're chucking tons of dice. Each monster has a deck of what they can do. And as you damage them and as you wound them, you remove some of those cards, limiting their action choices. So you might get down to where there's only 2 or 3 options, and then suddenly okay, we're going to be safe if we attack from this place because he no longer has the Raving Claw that does this thing. From a mythos perspective, this game does such a good job of establishing a world that feels so lovingly crafted. There's a ton of dice rolling, a ton of check for this, check for that, RPG elements that almost make it feel less like a board game to me and more like an RPG.
Yeah.
But then you go back to town, and then it's like, well, do you want to invest in this, or do you want to build a church? And what does that get you? And there's tech trees for what your village can do. And should you give all the good weapons to one person, or should you spread them out? And, my friends have done campaigns of this where they now have more information than when they started.
Right.
They now kind of know what the White Lion can do, and I had no idea what the White Lion could do, and there was sort of this transference of knowledge, no, you can't do that, and they were helping me figure out how to deal with the White Lion. I want to be very careful with what I say about this. I did not play it enough. We played it for maybe 4 or 5 hours, but, a real game of this, quote unquote, is you probably do 2 years and then you play it 15 times. But your civilization, has 9 people in it. And if those 9 people die, then you lose and you have to start over. So it's very similar to many video games in that way, where you're trying to learn the enemy's attack patterns, trying to constantly get better, but you might have to abandon your campaign. But it's so frustrating, right? Because your character could die. Like, it's roll a die, and if it's 1 to 5, you're dead. And even the amount of population you have in your town that defines your game is a die roll. Either it's 9, or it's 12, or it's 15. So for me and my house, this amount of randomness, the sheer insanity, makes it more of an experience. And it's still a game, like, don't get me wrong. But it's so lovingly made that I just am in awe. There's not many board games that inspire awe. There are things that inspire awe in my life, like Blade Runner 2049 and The Wheel of Time and Battlestar Galactica, and things that have this essence of almost like it's always existed,
Right.
and you're just experiencing it. And
Like something that's bigger than the descriptions on the page.
Correct. And the mythos and what was happening in this giant box full of crazy minis, and Curtis painted them, so they're beautiful. And a little bit of reverence for it, too, goes a long way. This is a very interesting experience. Not one for me. Probably not one for the type of person who likes the type of games that we like, to be honest. I think, Neelan, you're the closest thing from a video game perspective. I'd love to hear your hot take on it. And it's kind of interesting in a Gloomhaven world, right? Because it's not a Eurogame in any way. This is a very expensive game with tons of optional monsters that you can throw in and drawers full of... It's crazy. It's a lifestyle game. I don't really know how to describe it. I very much enjoyed playing Kingdom Death Monster. I would like to play it again, but it's sort of like, oh, we got lucky, or oh, we didn't get lucky. And it's so much of that you're along for the ride, and you do have choices. It would be unfair to say otherwise, but it just feels like we've moved beyond this type of thing but this type of thing is still very, very popular with a certain group of people.
So you say dice checker, and when you say dice checker, what I want is something along the lines of Cthulhu Wars, but this seems like it's way more swingy random.
Absolutely, way more.
Okay.
And constantly.
A couple of quick questions. Which you said you played it for about 4 or 5 hours. That was one hunt?
So we did the tutorial.
Okay.
You start with a fight.
Okay.
To see what you make back to camp. Then we established camp. We upgraded our stuff.
Okay.
And then we went back out with our upgraded stuff and did one more mission.
Okay, so this is a couple of sessions. So in the scenario that you're doing like a single session of this, a hunt, a town to visit, like how long would you think that would take on an average?
My guess is groups probably do 2 years, and that probably takes 3 to 4 hours, depending on how lucky you get.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, this time you're using, throwing around, you're saying it's 2 years, and you said something about a game being 30 years or something?
Campaign is 30 years.
And that's
or 35 or
okay,
something.
but that is like a hard cap? Is that what we're saying?
That's correct.
Okay.
And so
the
there are
game
different
will end at
there are different events that could happen that, and you're exploring down a path where at the beginning you can only fight the white line.
Right.
And then depending on what you've purchased, because you can put different monsters, you flip over new monsters. So we actually fought the white lion again.
Okay.
But he was stronger and had a little bit of some differences going on, and but we also had his testicles from a previous fight with him from the tutorial, which came in handy, I think. I can't remember. I don't think they did. So, very, very unique game, and one that I would recommend everyone try. I mean, it feels so different, and perhaps if you come from an RPG background, you've already experienced something like this.
Right.
But for me, I was the fish out of water here, and just in awe of what I was seeing, that this existed as a product that people were buying and loving, and it was quite impressive, is the only word I can say.
It sounds really, really interesting. I think the idea of picking up a massive campaign game, like, say, after I finish Gloomhaven, hypothetically, like, it's a game that sounds like it would have been appealing at a specific point in my life, and I find it hard to believe that I could necessarily experience it to its full without giving it, a specific focus and an amount of attention that it sounds like it needs.
Yeah, there's this discovery, like, a new event might happen, and then you have to turn to page 70, and there's a beautiful illustration on page 70, and it's a status effect that you've never heard of, or that it does something weird to your camp. And, the way that this group plays it, or the way that Kurt plays it, is that he has not, like, gone through and understood what all the status effects do. It's very much like a video game system that you explore as you go.
Interesting. That sounds neat.
That is Kingdom Death Monster. Probably the most try-hard title for a board game that I've run into.
So speaking of illustrations, I know you're not a huge fan of the Cthulhu mythos, that whole thing with Cthulhu Wars, and this is a game that is controversial in its illustration and its look. You said it's like beautiful in some ways, but are you put off by any of that stuff? Or?
So, yeah, there are a couple of different illustrators, and some of the style approaches. I think anime is also perhaps a big influence on this, a big power level, monster battles increasing. I think it's unfortunate that most of the depictions of women in the game are, they're big-chested. And I might not want to own it personally based on that. I know they're in the second or third Kickstarter, they started offering naked men as much as the naked women in the game as a direct response to some of that criticism. And, whether that solves the issue for you, I think is up to you to decide. The models and figures that we played with in my session didn't strike me as that. I haven't investigated incredibly deeply. So that is Kingdom Death Monster, a Sandy Peterson. I actually don't know who made it. Yeah, well, if only. But it does have some of that same, I'm going to make what I want to make, and if you want to buy it, here's the Kickstarter. And a lot of people want to buy it, Mark.
Unyielding vision. You know another man with a vision? Mr. Vital Lacerda. And I played one of his games this weekend, Vinhos. I actually played the Deluxe Edition, which is also very overproduced. I will say overproduced rather than well-produced, because the Deluxe Edition had a lot of very nice components, very big, chunky wooden pieces that we completely ignored. We decided not to use because it just felt like they'd be getting in the way, so we played with a lot of the base materials. But this is my second time playing the Deluxe Edition of Vinhos. The first time was a couple years ago, and
with me.
Was it with you?
Yeah,
oh yeah, right.
yeah,
You
I
and
played
me
with you.
and Andreas.
I think I won.
I think you did too. Okay, cool. Do you remember how you felt about that?
Oh yeah, no, I'm ready to jump in. Yeah, no, totally.
Excellent. I remember having a good feeling about it, but I didn't remember exactly why I had that feeling. So I was eager to play it again. And after having played a lot of his other games, I was looking forward to revisiting it. So Vinhos, as with a lot of his games, is a very complex, quite rules heavy, and the rules instruction took about 45 minutes. But once, like a lot of his other games, especially the ones that I like more, it's actually a very straightforward rule set once you know it. It's a worker placement game where you have one worker, which is similar to his other games like Kanban, and I believe Gallerist does the same thing. So you only have one worker, and you are selecting action on this quadrille in the center, and the actions you select are, I think there's just one of 5 or 6 different actions. So it's not like a big variety of different actions you can take. What you're doing in the game is you're a winemaker in Portugal. And one of the reasons why I think this game really works is the integration between the mechanics, and, Lacerda's games are known for being quite mechanics heavy, but the ties between the mechanics and the theme, I think, work quite well in Vinhos, and it really helps the game, I think. So you are winemakers in Portugal, and you are taking actions to plant vineyards from around the country. You are adding estates. You're hiring different kinds of workers and scientists to help you make the finest wines. You're adding cellars to increase the capacity of your estates. And you're doing this over the course of, I think it's 12 rounds. There are 3 fairs, which are sort of the big scoring moments of the game that sort of break up the game, that break it up into phases.
And how is that analogous to winemaking with those 3 phases of scoring?
You're going to a fair.
Literally
You're going
like
to a wine fair.
Taking your wine to a wine fair,
Yeah,
and having it be judged, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
There are like
Yeah,
different judges
you're
that like different types of wines.
Exactly. Yeah, you're submitting a wine to the wine fair, and you're trying
Portugal?
In Portugal.
Are there 3 wine fairs in a year in Portugal?
Yeah, the 3 Portuguese wine fairs.
You don't, yeah.
And obviously not a connoisseur.
Tzolk'in.
Yeah, that's right. So you are submitting a wine to the wine fairs 3 times during the game. The first wine fair comes after the 6th round of the game. The second wine fair comes after 4 more rounds, and then the final wine fair occurs just 2 rounds after the second one. So you get less and less time between wine fairs. And the game itself is fairly quick. Again, once you get the rules, as we're playing it, a lot of comments were made at the end of the game like, oh, if we ran this back, it'd be a much faster game because you're not overwhelmed with choices. There's just a few choices. The economy is pretty tight, and so you sort of know what your options are, and there's not a lot of room for AP. Before I get to what I thought of it, Neil, what are your recollections of Vinhos?
It's been long enough that it's actually genuinely hard to recall. This might have been actually one of the first games I played with you, actually, because it's a couple of years ago.
Sure.
But soured the experience.
I remember liking it distinctly, so that I think it was very close to actually being in my top 50 when I was compiling it at the end of last year. And also is notably one of the few Lacerda games I played with that I did actually really like. And I've not played that many of his games, but I feel like I've bounced off of the other ones I've played. Vinhos Deluxe is a game that I've actually been tempted to go back to. The idea of relearning the rules for it is extremely daunting because I do remember it being extremely heavy, but I do remember enjoying it. Like I said, I think I won that game of it, and I remember feeling like getting to the grasp of the mechanics and how quickly you sort of learn to play it over the course of it. Like I said, it starts to just get this real solid like flow in the middle of it, just that it doesn't seem like it would get there early on. And I think it's so rich in actually living up to the theme. Everything you're doing is just literally what you would be doing. It's getting cellars, getting wine,
hiring nuclear scientists.
Well, wine scientists, right?
Enologists. They're called enologists, I hope.
I think that's right, yeah. And then some of the judges are like,
you don't even know about the 3 wine fairs of Portugal. Why are you even talking?
And then, each of the judges is like, okay, this judge only likes red wine.
Right.
Or it's like wine from this region or something.
Yeah,
so
one judge likes a certain color, one judge wants a certain value, one judge wants a certain region.
So it's like you're almost like trying to like bribe them a little bit by playing to their taste. It's got fun little systems like that. Yeah, I remember liking it a lot.
Yeah, I think for me, when it comes to Lacerda, you're always going to get a lot of mechanics, but I think when he does it well, he does it in a game like this or a game like Kanban, where the mechanics sort of make sense with the theme and things flow together sort of well. So you have to keep the mechanics and the rules in your head, but because the mechanics seem married to it, it's not as much of a burden.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when it came to Escape Plan, for example, the mechanics felt like they were sort of butting up against the theme. Like the theme, it wasn't
the
necessarily...
theme was like richer and looser than the mechanics allowed.
Right, so it didn't really help. Yeah, the richness of the theme in a game like Escape Plan, which you want to be about a heist and exciting, like it sort of clashes with the heaviness of the rules and the mechanical nature of it. So yeah, that is Vital Lacerda's Vinhos.
That's going to do it for the games that we played this week. If you'd like to join in the discussion, you can join in the discussion at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. That's DISCORD. We have a lively group of people. There's almost always 40 to 50 people talking board games in the chat room. So if you want to come talk to us, please do. We are starting to get ready for Gen Con 2019 and Shucks, also in 2019. So if you want to come talk to us about those conventions, please do. As always, we will now read a review of the podcast. These reviews really help us, guys. They help keep our spirits high, and they help keep the podcast moving forward. We're getting close to 100, and I feel like we got to give something to our 100th review. We're right about 80.
I don't think we should give something to our 100th review. I think we should pick one at random, right? Or you should do something on the 100th review. If you guys write 100 reviews, then Kellen will...
Your fate is 2. This review, I will reveal the name of who wrote it at the end.
Ooh.
Flawed host, great podcast. First, the tongue firmly in cheek bad. One host speaks English but not American.
It's a positive.
I don't think tongue needs to be in cheek. I think
missile is a 2-syllable word, not 3, and it is pronounced podcast, not podcast.
That was flawless.
The second host hates co-ops and has a tendency to up-talk at the end of his sentences, which is common among co-op haters. That's me. What is up-talk?
What is up-talk?
I don't have much bad to say about the third host, except that he has no emotional attachments to games and will flip them like an HGTV host on steroids.
Fair. Totally fair.
But seriously, these three have great chemistry, are concise and entertaining, great podcast. This review comes to us from Green Warrior.
There you go.
So there's a little bit of a problem there.
There's a little bit of a problem there?
Well, you know...
Why are you not up-talking anymore?
I had the Red Barracks going for a while as a channel on the Discord, and Neelan shut me down.
I found the barracks.
So
I dismantled it.
You can't have war. Where did you get warriors, dude? Where are they being trained?
Yeah, I can't keep them away.
Thank you for the fantastic review.
Yeah, that's really funny.
We appreciate all of them. We're excited to read all of them. It does seem like people are trying to one-up each other, which is also awesome.
Which is great.
Yes. So now let us move on to our featured topic, which is board game terminology. I think there are so much disagreement about what some of these words mean that it is fun to talk about them. So the words that we will be talking about on this episode are Fiddly, Crunchy, Degenerate, and Eurogame versus Ameritrash. Let's start with an easy one. The one that is on the list because of Neelan. Crunchy. Neelan?
Yeah.
Why don't you look at my iPad and tell us what you see?
I'm going to say that's Captain Crunch.
Captain Crunch berries, Neelan.
I'm sorry.
Can't you
Meeple.
see this?
A non-American wouldn't.
Yeah, I win there.
That's written right under the word crunchy.
Is it delicious? Wait, what? It's not written anywhere.
It says crunchy.
Yeah, I can read crunchy. The berries part?
Now with more crunch. What is crunchy in a board game?
Breakfast cereal.
These are in my show notes, guys. There's a lot of pictures.
I like that.
to help
I
me.
like that you decided to include the Captain Crunch picture in your notes for the episode. Crunchy for me strikes me as something that I'm not entirely sure I actually know. That I made a point of actually looking up the definitions for these, to be clear. But my understanding on what crunchy means is just having a lot to think about in a game, like having to make a lot of hard decisions. Is that right?
Yeah, that's how I would interpret it.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's important to say that a lot of these words are used in a specific way in board gaming, and occasionally they morph or change over time. You know, the impetus for this episode was a discussion about the word degenerate, which we'll get to soon. But I found a lot of disagreements on specifically crunchy.
Oh, like people disagreeing on the definition of it?
Correct.
Huh.
Oh, so maybe give us examples of how they disagree. Because when I think crunchy, I think what Neelan is sort of mentioning, a game that's filled with difficult or hard decisions.
Like Vinhos, for example, like
Right.
seems like the way you're describing it.
Right.
Like, yeah.
I wouldn't say they're disagreements per se, but there are a couple of popular things to say here. So let me ask you this. How does this relate to peanut butter?
What are you talking about?
So
I have no idea.
Well, no, there's crunchy and smooth peanut butter,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
And smooth peanut butter flows nicely, whereas crunchy peanut butter, you get caught up on all the peanuts and the peanuts, and you have to like bite down onto them occasionally, and that's harder to do. Am I going anywhere in the right direction here?
So Eric Summer of the Dice Tower has said that when he uses the word crunchy, he's talking about the difference between smooth peanut butter and crunchy peanut butter. Whereas a smooth game, the decisions flow somewhat effortlessly, and
Okay.
crunchy has these moments where you must stop and
reflect.
Correct.
Okay.
I've also seen it described like a gear, and there is a series of interlocking gears that crunch together.
Okay.
Sure.
But a lot of people believe that it mostly comes from getting your teeth into something, or the idiom, which is sink your teeth into something.
Okay.
Right. A word that is often substituted for crunchy is like meaty or meat on the bones. Would you guys think that those are two different? I think if a person calls a game crunchy or meaty,
Ooh, I actually don't know if I would think they were saying the same thing.
maybe not. Crunchy is more about decision making, and meaty is maybe
Feels more like
about
weight.
Yeah,
Yeah.
depth. Yeah. But I feel like they're in the same ballpark. But yeah, there is a distinction. There's a nuance there. When it comes to meaty and crunchy, are these terms that you guys
Often apply to peanut butter. Meaty, definitely.
Neelan uses these terms.
I use crunchy.
And meat on the bones. Yes, you do.
I've
Yes,
never
you do.
said meat on the bones.
Yes, you do. Don't
Hexagon.
lie to me.
That does not sound like a thing I've ever said.
Yeah, there's meat on the bones. You do say it because I always wonder what you're talking about.
I don't.
Yes.
I know
Maybe.
that we have faithful listeners out there who have transcribed every word. we've
Yeah,
said,
exactly.
So just run it back and
I'm
let
just
us
going
know
to
where
get like
it
an audio clip of every
right.
cut of every time I've said meat on the bones of the podcast.
And I think when you say it, which you do say it,
Okay.
you're talking, and I don't know if this is the right definition, but you're saying it like, is there substance
Yeah,
there?
exactly.
And so my question is, do you guys reflexively like shy away from these?
Yes.
You do?
I hate the word crunchy, and Neelan loves it. He
Wait,
says,
but does that mean you shy away from crunchy games or describing games as crunchy?
Describe.
Or, I mean,
describing games as crunchy.
Yeah.
I think that Mr. Lacerda has gone off the deep end here with his series of interlocking gears, and that clockmakers are weird, man, and that's why we don't have them anymore.
we've lost all our clockmakers in the audience.
But yeah, I tend to shy away from the word crunchy. I actually don't have a problem with it. I think language moves and changes, and the words that I use specifically, I go in phases where I'll pick up a new word and then start using it. I just try not to do that when it's Neelan talking.
The reason I bring it up is because I have no problem with the terms crunchy and meaty. I know they're sort of they become cliche, but when somebody says that, I sort of know what they're saying. You know,
Yeah.
it's shorthand that works for me, and I don't think it's overused or incorrectly used to the point where it's become something that I have a negative connotation with. For me, if somebody says crunchy or meaty, I know what they're saying, and it's fine.
See, it's like the term thinky is also applied, or the term brain burner, I've heard.
Yeah.
I think I've heard you use the term brain burner.
I'm sure I have. Yeah, no,
That's fine.
Yeah.
You do you, man.
Right.
Which is, a phrase that I came up with. I think it's self-evident what games are crunchy. Mr. Lacerda's games are very crunchy. I think something about that series of interlocking systems is how I lean when I think of crunchy.
Right.
Which is like there's so much to sort of push together. And I like putting three gears in my head that are all like trying to like crunch. That, for me, made a lot more sense than peanut butter.
I would agree with that. Yeah. It's more about like the dominoes falling. You're sort of seeing how things interlock, and moving one will move the other.
That is crunchy. All right, the next word we have is fiddly. So, today's hot question, Neelan?
Hot question.
Which Board Game Barrage host is the most fiddly?
Huh.
And-
Wait, as a personality characteristic?
Yeah, just when
Yeah.
you think when you say fiddly, which one of us is the most fiddly?
That's right. And we're going to count down from 3.
Sure.
3, 2, 1.
Nealon.
Did we
You
all say
picked
Neil?
Nealon?
Of course I picked myself. I was paging through this notebook as I was writing it, and it's just filled with like terrible doodles. I have like double pages here. Some of these are disgusting. Look at this.
They are. They're very
Look at
graphic.
this. This is while I'm recording the podcast.
Yeah,
I'm a very fiddly person by nature.
You fiddle?
I fiddle constantly.
What is a fiddliness in a board game, Mark?
Whether it's necessary or not, but a game with a lot of components, a game with a lot of chits, a lot of bookkeeping, I think, is a game that's fiddly. Even a game that doesn't necessarily have a lot of components, which I think is the number one criteria for fiddliness, is if a game has a lot of components. But even if it doesn't, if there's a lot of bookkeeping, if there's a lot of keeping track of how many hit points everything has, or keeping track of how every stock moves and all this kind of stuff, that would also qualify as fiddly in my definition of it. So either a lot of bits or constantly maintaining a number of bits or trackers or charts.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it boils down to either being about rules or components. My one sentence summary of this is if you need to do a lot to accomplish a simple action.
Sure.
So whether that's like moving a lot of pieces mechanically or just going through a very convoluted rule set to do
Right.
it.
See, I have no problem with a ton of components, and I actually enjoy it in general. But I think that I usually use the word fiddly when I'm referring to a upkeep phase, or a phase in which you're not taking actions. You know, I think Agricola is fiddly, and I don't think Agricola is fiddly because of the amount of components it has, personally. But it's like in between the round, you got to refill 17 different silos, and it takes a while to get to that, and it's sort of ticky-tacky. You're kind of doing a lot, and there's a lot of rules to remember between the turns on what happens. And I guess that's related to the amount of components it has, but I might describe a game as arduous if you're physically moving stuff around and it's annoying. But I might not be the best person for this definition because of Mr. Nealon, Mr. Fiddler.
Yeah.
Mr. Fiddler.
Mr. Fiddler.
Mr. Fiddler.
Fister and Mr. Fiddler.
Oh,
We're
Mr. Fister.
We're a two-man group.
So let us move on to the heart of our discussion. Degenerate versus broken.
Nealon is broken and you're a degenerate.
That was easy. One sentence for 2 words.
There you go.
Okay, so we have started using the word degenerate. I think this is a word I picked up in the last 2 months, and Kurt has called me on it. He said, I don't think you're using the word degenerate correctly. What is the difference between a degenerate strategy and a broken strategy, Nealon?
My quick take of this, when a strategy becomes degenerate, the game has progressed to a point where several systems aren't meaningful anymore. The core gameplay has somehow been lost in the process. Like, it's a strategy that is sort of negating a substantial core of the game, which to me is a very different thing to a broken strategy, which is one that might be manipulating all the elements of the game, but it's one that's clearly unbalanced or leads to an unfun game. Degenerate implies that the game design has suffered as a result of it, whereas broken could just be the result of balance testing more than anything else.
So the easiest example is A Few Acres of Snow. Halifax Hammer is broken,
Right.
but not degenerate. But I think an example of a potentially degenerate strategy is actually in Tzolk'in, a game I have not played. And maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, you can ignore a lot of the subsystems and just get corn, and
Right.
and it kind of works occasionally.
Yeah, or there's like building heavy strategies where you focus on one small aspect of the larger strategy while ignoring others entirely. That does feel in the direction of degenerates to me.
And another example of a degenerate strategy, or I felt like I was playing degenerately, was in the most recent game of Archipelago that I won as the Hidden Trader. You're welcome, guys. I feel like in Archipelago, the Hidden Trader should be trying to hide but lead a revolt of the people. There's a lot of crises. You're trying to get everyone to not contribute, to be selfish, but you're lying in wait for your one moment. And in this 4 or 5 player game of Archipelago, I felt like I had to come out as the trader really early and then just take really selfish actions from about almost the halfway point of the game. And I won, and I didn't feel real good about it. And I don't know that it was actually degenerate, but it's just all I did was all the actions that hurt the civilization. It was like tax, 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 grow my population. And they're just groaning, but there was not much counterplay that they could do. Yeah. And I was not proud of my degenerate self in that game of Archipelago. But perhaps it's not, in your definition, not degenerate, but it didn't feel good like it usually does.
Interesting. You've reminded me of what might be a good example of my definition. And again, this is based on my perception more than anything else. But the thing, Infected Outpost 31, there's a lot of talk about an optimal infected strategy being to ignore sabotaging the entire game and just sneak onto the helicopter at the end, which obviously means that you're subverting 90% of the mechanics of the game in the interest of a win, which feels degenerate to me.
Right.
Not in the spirit of what the game is trying to encourage. Any thoughts on degenerate, Mark?
When this was a word that we were thinking about discussing, what came to mind was your calling in our last game of Dune.
Yeah.
Calling the tactic employed by myself, your brother, and the blue tank a degenerate strategy, and that just struck me as wrong. It seemed like a legitimate strategy given our positions on the board and our powers, and when you called it degenerate, it sort of felt like you were accusing us of playing the game in a way that was purposely making the game less fun when it felt like a clear strategy. And I mean, that struck me as an interesting way for me to think about it and you to classify it.
Yeah, it's very hard to know in a game with wildly asymmetric powers, whether that alliance, if that alliance meant that Neil and I and Dan could not win, and one of the three of you would win, and you were 90% likely to be the one that would win.
Right.
We might not know that, but the fact that the three of you could just from the beginning of the game decide, well, one of the three of us will win, felt borderline degenerate. I agree with you in the strictest sense. It doesn't make sense. Glorantha actually has a lot of people talking about this with letting the sun player out of hell.
Oh, interesting.
And if everyone just agrees not to do it, that player maybe can't win or has a much less harder time to win. So would it be degenerate to just say, well, like the three of us, no, we're not going to do, like, why would we do that? We have no incentive. Like, there isn't enough incentive, and the three of you can just agree. And that's not really in this, probably in the Glorantha case, that's not in the spirit of the game. The spirit of the game is that someone should offer enough to allow the sun to come out of hell.
Sure.
I think that you are correct. That I'm mixing emotions and some game talk in the sense that when I play a game for the first time, not all the time, and when it's the three of us, I think I err on the side of I'll kill you.
Yeah, right.
But in broader, bigger games, I err on the side of ensuring fun.
Yeah.
For all, and what you were doing was definitely not that.
That's fair, and
that felt as a human being degenerate.
Okay, sure. And bringing up the Glorantha point is interesting because I wonder, like, if we were more well versed in Dune and we knew for a fact that combination made it so that we were like in the 90% and you guys were out, that would feel degenerate to me. I would more agree with you there if that was like mathematically proven. Because when you say it about Glorantha, if you're showing me the numbers and the sub player wins 5% of the time if you don't let him out, that sort of feels degenerate to me if you play it that way. But that feels like a flaw in game design too.
Absolutely. And I think that strictly speaking, I was wrong and salty and just wanted to call you a degenerate.
Right. That's fair. I feel the same way. So,
all right, the last one, and perhaps the biggest one or the most interesting one, is the Eurogame versus the Ameritrash game. So let's start with what is a Eurogame.
So a Eurogame is a game that is focused on the mechanics rather than the theme. I think if you have a spectrum and one of the sides of the spectrum was theme and the other one was mechanics, games that are on the mechanic side are going to be the ones that are Euro-style games. Ones that are more about the theme and evoking the theme would be the Ameritrash style of games. I think that's the biggest thing that separates them.
Euro games are fiddly, crunchy, and deterministic, and Ameritrash games are broken and degenerate.
Did you say American games?
And they're Ameritrash games.
Did he say?
I think he said American.
Oh, maybe I said American.
I think he said burn the flag, too, on his breath.
How
I might have.
dare you, sir? Did you listen to our review?
Our review of,
from the Green
podcast?
Tank?
Yeah.
Or Green
Totally.
Warrior.
He accused my Englishness of not being appropriate for the podcast. Callan.
So I think it's important to talk about a little bit where these words come from. I can never say this word, etymology. Eurogame, I believe, is specifically referencing games from Germany.
Right.
And Ameritrash is not meant as a pejorative. I think that Board Game Geek has correctly changed this definition to thematic, is how they classify the games on Board Game Geek, instead of Ameritrash. I believe these games were old Avalon Hill games like Betrayal at the House on the Hill, Arkham Horror, Cosmic Encounter, Descent, Twilight Imperium are all classic Ameritrashy games designed and made in the US of A.
That's true. I mean, I think there was a time where a lot of games were called German-style games because they were a certain flavor of games coming out of Germany. They were called German-style games, and that's just sort of evolved into Euros. And on the other side...
So is the idea that Euro is what would have been called? Because I still hear people describe games as German-style.
Yeah.
Do you think that's basically mean the same thing at this point?
It's literally the same.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I think perhaps the most interesting thing here, and one thing that we have alluded to or talked about or I have bitched about, perhaps, is the Eurogame has come to be classified by less conflict or less player interaction, and that is not how it started. Some of the classic Eurogames feature a ton of... El Grande is a classic Eurogame. I don't know that you could classify it as a Eurogame still. Perhaps you could.
Right.
But it would fit somewhere in this weird middle ground.
Yeah, I agree with that.
One of the things that I feel like Eurogames do is that everything you do in the game is positive, right? And that's not always the case, but a Eurogame is traditionally dominated by victory points, and everything you do scores you points. So it's a question of how many points do you get, and someone scores more points than you do. Neelan, good job. You scored 26. Mark scored 150, but congratulations. Whereas in a Ameritrash game, like Risk is a quintessential Ameritrash game, someone is losing.
Right.
So you're not gaining victory points. Your civilization is decaying, and you're getting more and more upset as you go.
Yeah.
And that feels like a bit of a distinction between the two.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. There is a big distinction between where the conflict is and how the conflict is implemented in the game. When it comes to an Ameritrash game, your conflict is often direct and destructive to your opponent. You know what I mean? You are destroying somebody else's army, you're destroying somebody else's civilization.
And typically targeted at any given time to a specific player.
That's correct, yeah. And then whereas with a Euro-style game or German-style game, it's more about indirect competition. It's more about, I'm going to take a spot before you do. You're still going to be able to get something on your turn, but I'm going to get the more prime location before you do. So it's about indirect competition, indirect confrontation. It's more about, you hear terms like blocking being one of the main ways interaction occurs in a Euro-style game.
But with our modern wave of worker placement games, you don't even have to block people. You can all go on any space you want. Wow. Okay, so I think that the most interesting thing here perhaps is the hybridization of these two genres. There are many games that obviously blend all of these lines, and when you start making genres, everyone's going to start talking about why this music is not like that music, but it's not emo, but it's screamo, and it's annoying. But I think that it'd be helpful to illustrate some hybrid game designs. I think that a really easy one, and I kind of think of these like knobs or levers that sort of twist towards one side or the other. I think Scythe is a fantastic example of clearly a Euro game that has incorporated some Ameritrash trappings. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the hybrid, where that exists on the hybrid is, in my opinion, much, much closer to Eurogame.
Sure.
But it still exists on a spectrum that I feel like it's pushing up against a hybrid design, and that's part of what makes it immensely popular.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, for example, if we take Scythe, I think there are sort of three spectrums when it comes to determining whether a game is going to be classified as Euro or Ameritrash. One is, does it lean mechanisms? If it is, it's more Euro. If it does lean thematic, if it is, it's more Ameritrash.
I agree with that completely, because really quick, what I wrote down here as my brief summary is Euro games are more about systems and Ameritrash games are more about experiences.
Sure.
Which sounds like kind of what you were saying, right?
Yeah. So that, for me, that's the first spectrum.
I think that is...
that's like...
a pejorative towards thematic games, a little bit.
Well, you wouldn't agree that like the aim of a thematic game is more about providing an experience over a mechanical system?
I mean, so we can use Dune as an example.
Uh-huh.
I believe that the fun in Dune is obviously an interesting experience, but it's giving everyone an asymmetrical power and then watching how those jam together. I don't think that's an experience. I believe it's a very tightly created system of powers that interlock together in weird and interesting ways.
Right. I guess, I mean, I'm not using experience as a pejorative in this sense. Like, I would agree that Dune to me is a stronger experience than it is a mechanically sound game. To the extent that we were just describing it 5 minutes ago as potentially degenerate. But it was still a fun shared experience, and one that I would absolutely relive. And that's not using experience at all pejoratively. Like, I think that it provided a very unique thematic feel.
I think that I believe that these terms will evolve. Perhaps this is what I'm actually saying. And that the evolution of these terms is found because most games are incorporating what's good about Eurogames. Mm-hmm. A lot of the Dudes on a Map games that are coming out now, the Ameritrashy games, are incorporating a lot of these mechanical subsystems. So to me, where we will end up, perhaps in a few years, is that Ameritrash versus Euro, the spectrum will be more about the amount of direct player conflict that exists and less about does it care about the mechanisms, because all games kind of must care about the mechanisms.
Sure.
Yeah. Just to wrap up my three sort of...
Sorry.
No problem. No, that's fine. That's great. My three spectrums. The first one is lean mechanics, lean theme. Second one would be where the confrontation is. Is it direct confrontation versus indirect? That's the second sort of bar. And the third one for me is the randomness. Is it highly random? If that's so, it leans more Ameritrash. If it's not random, if it's more deterministic, then it leans Euro. And a game can be on one side in one respect and one side in the other, but sort of where the average lines up is where I would sort of classify a game. So for example, Scythe, I would say it's more mechanisms than theme, but it definitely does try to get on the theme side. But the confrontation is more indirect than direct, but there is touches of directness. And when it comes to randomness or deterministic, there's some randomness, but it does feel very Euro-y in terms of its non-randomness. There's no dice rolling and stuff. So it's sort of in the center, but I think it does fall on the Euro side.
Luck was a contentious point for me because I think Eurogames are better at hiding their luck more than necessarily being less about luck. I think like any game that has a strong card play deck element is a lot more luck based than most people would claim versus just rolling a ton of dice.
Right.
I think it's one of the characteristics of the way that they utilize luck.
I would say in Euro games, a lot of times the luck is shared.
Front loaded or shared.
Or shared, yeah. Like in a lot of Euro games, there is something randomly determined, but it affects everybody equally.
Yeah.
You know, there's a plague that is affecting all the players and they all have to deal with it on their own board, but it's a shared injection of randomness. Same thing with Vinhos. Vinhos, there's weather that changes round to round, but everybody has to deal with weather. If it's good weather, the wine's going to be better. If it's bad weather, it's going to be worse, but it's going to be worse for everybody.
I think that more than anything else, this discussion for me has made me realize that I think these terms are outdated and kind of unhelpful.
Yeah.
Because we can describe things better. And even the difference between what's a strategy game versus what's a Euro game is confusing to me. And then a game like chess, you know, is entirely deterministic, let's say. You always know what will happen in a game of chess, but it's extremely confrontational. Right. And it's also was created before anyone in Germany made a Euro game.
Sure.
So it's like, where does that fit in?
Right.
It's not either, really.
Right.
I think it's very interesting because you would say, well, where do you fit in on the spectrum? You know, and that's kind of an interesting thing because I think, Neelan, we could clearly say that you're more of a Euro player than a thematic player, but maybe that's not the case.
Well, but the funny thing is I feel to some extent I lean more Ameritrashy than the two of you do. Like
Wow.
What?
Oh, stop
like,
the presses.
No, I mean, I don't know. Like, I feel like some of the games are like the archetypical Ameritrash games are games that I'm more willing to play than either of you. I don't know. Like something like a Zombie Side, say. Or like Kingdom Death Monster.
Have you played Kingdom Death Monster?
No, I haven't, but you were describing it as something that would probably appeal to me the most.
I could tell by the look in Neelan's eyes that he would like it more than you.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting. I also recently played Warhammer Underworlds, Shadespire.
Yeah, Warhammer is a great example of this, actually. I freaking love Warhammer.
And this is the new Shadespire system that injects Euro objectives into the game, but every single combat is still roll a bunch of dice, and it just makes no sense to me at all. So I do personally dislike vast amounts of luck.
Yeah.
So when people describe thematic games as something that I like because of the conflict, and then they say, well, it's all about luck, or it's not all about luck, but luck is a strong component of it, I kind of get confused.
Sure.
And so I think that hybrid design, these are games like Kemet, these are games like Cyclades. Even those two are great examples, right? Cyclades is perhaps a little more Euro because it's very auction-y, and Kemet is a lot more Ameritrashy because it's very conflict-driven.
Right. Although it's deterministic, I would say. There's not a lot of randomness.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's to your point, though, that these are all on spectrums, and to classify them as one or the other, you lose a lot of subtlety.
Yeah, and so that goes to games that we also like Lords of Hellas,
Right.
where it almost feels like what I want is for them to hide their Euro elements. And when it's too obvious what's happening, I get annoyed, which is kind of odd or interesting. Who can say? Any closing thoughts on America the Beautiful and Europe Trash?
These were our new proposed names for these.
Yeah, we thought we're done with the old ones. We're bringing in the new ones.
Right.
This will be much more clear for everyone listening.
Great America and Eurotrash. Perfect.
I think Eurotrash is already a phrase, right?
Is it like for music or something like that?
I don't know.
That's going to do it for our episode on board game terminology. If there's any more board game terminology you would like clarified by me and these two,
Because if nothing, we've clarified all of these
I feel like
terms
these are
perfectly.
crystal.
it's very clear.
Yeah, it is very clear.
Absolutely.
From the darkness comes the light.
That's right.
When you're at your deepest moment, staring at the abyss, at the precipice, that's where you'll find your light. Thanks so much for tuning in. As always, you can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can reach out to us on Twitter. You can reach out to us on Instagram, on Facebook, on Board Game Geek. Join our guild, boardgamebarrage.com/guild. Join us on Discord. We're having a ton of fun on Discord, boardgamebarrage.com/discord. We are everywhere that you want to be. And as always, thank you so much to Heart Society Music for letting us use their song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? Because it's always important to ask children what they're thinking about. Thanks so much. I'm Callan Allen.
Signing off.
Goodbye. Bye. So long. Okay. Before we end, all right, Neelan,
Yeah.
I'm going to hand you this, and then you're just going to read it,
Okay.
and then do what it says.
I love that.
This.
Can we? Okay.
This
I-
was.
You're going to hand me a thing. I'm going to read it and do
Well,
what
it's
it says.
kind of long. So, a genius on our Discord, Wal Wilson and I, have come up with this. So anyway, here you go. So just start at the bottom and go tell Fiddly.
Sorry, right at the top.
Very top.
Okay. Please read the following key board game components and phrases in 4 pitches or speeds. Do not ask questions, and whatever you do not pass go. High speed, normal pitch. By high speed, just read them as quickly as possible. Is that what that means?
Who could say?
Who could say?
Meeples, minis, chits, dice, tile, pawn, cube, disc, deck, gem, tiddlywink, hexagon, hex. Now at normal speed, normal pitch. Meeple, minis, chits, dice, tile, pawn, cube, disc, deck, gem, tiddlywink, hexagon, hex. Normal speed, high pitch. Meeple, why am I doing this?
Don't know, but you should do it. Do it.
Meeple, minis, chits, dice, tile, pawn, cube, disc, deck, gem, tiddlywink, hexagon, hex.
Why do you keep saying porn?
Porn?
Pawn.
One pawn.
I know, but it sounds like porn when he says it.
Eurotrash.
Yeah.
Slowly low pitch. Meeple, minis, chits, dice, tile, pawn, cube, disc, deck, gem, tiddlywink, hexagon, hex.
That was
Meeple.
incredible.
Yeah. I'm
Why,
sure.
why did I do this? I don't
Just wait.
understand.
Just wait.